Joining us today is Karen Feridun from the Better Path Coalition. Hi, Karen. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Stuart. Happy to be here.
So why don't we just start briefly? Tell me about the Better Path Coalition and what you guys do and how you've connected with them.
Well, we got our start and our orientation is still centered around fracking. And so in 2018, working with a bunch of pipeline groups, actually, because there hadn't been as much cohesion across all the different pipeline efforts because they're so scattered and, sort of got their own geography to them. But we had decided it was important to kind of come together to talk about the natural gas pipeline build out. And quickly that conversation turned into, well, we can't really leave out fracking. Well, we can't really leave out climate change. So we ended up forming this coalition across the state of Pennsylvania that represented all of those issues. And again, at its heart was the fact that we don't need to be fracking. We need to stop fracking and transition as quickly as we can to renewables. But one thing that happens when you do this kind of work, I know you know this, is that the situation morphs all the time. And so we seem to go from one boom to another. And it was petrochemicals and then hydrogen hubs. And then when that looked like that was going away, they quickly pivoted to data centers. And all of a sudden we have this crashing need to have data centers everywhere. And so we kind of follow the work where it takes us.
And so data centers are your, not your only focus, but is that predominantly your focus at the moment?
Well, it is, although we do a lot of work on, well, now that hydrogen hubs are coming back, we're monitoring to see, what we need to do there. But, we've also worked on things like LNG, just pretty much everything. But right now, the hot topic in Pennsylvania is data centers. So we're doing a lot of our work there.
You just helped to host a virtual town hall on data centers. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so we've been frustrated, frankly, that people feel very blindsided by the coming of all these data centers. They don't feel that the state has ever made the case for the need to have these data centers, especially with this kind of rush, when so little is really known about them in terms of like academic research. But a lot of people in places like Virginia have amazing testimonials to share about how impacted they have been. So, why do we have to leap before we look? Always. Why can't we take the time to see if we need to do this at all, where they should go, how they should be regulated? We just, we are inclined to always take a hard-nosed stance on things. But in this case, they didn't even bother trying to tell us why we should support them. And so we were frustrated that people were left out of the decision-making process, that they were never asked if they wanted these things in their communities. And we were pressing on the governor to, as the person who probably heads the state government in a way that even legislators don't, who can go out into their districts and do town halls. The governor is the one person who could do something statewide. And he didn't. And we were pressing on him to do something. And then we, at the beginning of the year, we decided that we would host the town hall, but we would try to work with the governor's office. And so we reached out and we said, we'd like to do this town hall. And they wrote back and said, sorry, he's not available. And then we said, well, we didn't give you a date. So how can you tell us, he's not available? And so we wrote back and said, okay, here's every date in the month of March, pick one. And they said, he's not available. So we decided to schedule one ourselves, tell him when it was going to be, and then really pressure him to attend. And so we selected May 13th, and that gave us, a little bit more than a month to organize. And we, had thousands and thousands of people signing a giant invitation. We took a 4-foot engraved invitation to Harrisburg to his office. We had 74 organizations represented there, not just the individuals. And then we had people doing a call-in day, and people were calling his office anyhow. And we had people submit meeting requests, which, is one of the steps you have to take. So we said, everybody do one. And so lots of people were submitting meeting requests, inviting him to come. And he just ignored all of it.
So what do you make of that exactly? Because one of the things I heard it on the virtual town hall, but also elsewhere, is people that originally were very supportive of Shapiro are really cooling on him because of this. What's your feeling on him kind of snubbing this issue, despite the fact that he's been such a vocal proponent of data centers in Pennsylvania?
Well, it's no surprise. We were disappointed, but not surprised that he didn't respond because he's not responsive and he has never been a great advocate for the people. I mean, this goes back to when he was Attorney General, and he really threw the people of Dimock, Pennsylvania under the bus by showboating about how he was going after the frackers. But in the end, the company that was responsible for all that damage in Dimock pled down to one misdemeanor from I think it was nine felony counts and six misdemeanor counts, down to one misdemeanor from contaminated water. And then they pled no contest to that. And in exchange for that, while he's on stage taking his bows and using the people of Dimock as props, the DEP was having a meeting with the company saying, we're lifting the moratorium because you were such good buddies to us by, pleading down to the misdemeanor. And so those people now in Dimock have, they're back in the thick of it. They have no assistance. They were supposed to have water supplied to their community as a result of this deal that was arranged so that there would be no fracking at all until they had water. They don't have water, but the fracking's begun again. And so, he pretty much vanished as soon as that press conference was over. As governor, he's done nothing to help them. And so, that's who we know him to be. So, we weren't at all surprised. Like I said, disappointed that given that this is such a huge issue across the state, not just in areas that are being fracked, that he didn't take a different stance. But in the end, it's not that surprising.
One of the issues that we experience with exposure is, we're constantly trying to get people to understand the connection between petrochemicals and fracking, because often that connection just doesn't exist in people's minds. What do you make of the connection between fracking and data centers?
Yeah, I mean, I was saying earlier that we seem to go from one boom to the next. And so the through line is fracking. So petrochemicals is ethane, fracking. And, the hydrogen hub would have been blue hydrogen in the western part of the state. And we think even in the eastern part where we had two hubs, but, behind it all is blue hydrogen that is based on a methane feedstock and uses methane for some of its power. And so with data centers, it doesn't seem as connected, but really, when you look at how the data centers would be powered, natural gas, and so more fracking. And they had the summit on your side of the state. I'm in eastern Pennsylvania, but on I guess it was last July they had McCormick Summit in Pittsburgh, talking about energy and talking about data centers, and they brought billions of dollars of new investments to the state for data centers. But I'm told, and what I read in some of the press was that the thing they were really talking about when they were talking about the energy side was natural gas. So even though there are a couple that have been proposed, for instance, like 3 Mile Island coming back online to power Microsoft so that they can create the 21st century version of Clippy, so there's some examples, in other words, of nuclear going online to support these data centers, but the new energy is predominantly natural gas, as far as we can tell.
Now, one of the issues that I've always had with environmental nonprofits and activists is this issue of kind of preaching to the choir and being just very siloed in their own world. And so what I've kind of made a point of doing in my work is trying to speak to those people who are not necessarily in that echo chamber. And so what do you say to the folks who see these projects and they really latch on to the idea of jobs and economic boost to the state and to tax revenues and to school districts and so on? Because that to me is like really the biggest hurdle in dealing with any kind of industrial development. So what's your response to those folks?
I wouldn't really disagree, but I would disagree a little bit in that I think underlying some of the things that persuade people when they hear about the jobs and all of that part is that there's this kind of belief. I think it's going away now. It's eroded a lot in the past few years, but I think there was always a sort of belief that the government was there to protect us, and that if it was really that bad, they wouldn't let it happen. I mean, if you think about that movie now, the classic documentary Gasland, you heard people say that in that film, that they really thought that if the government was there to protect them, this would not be happening, and that somehow this is sort of waking them up to the reality. And so I think there are still people out there, fewer of them than before, but there's still people out there who think that that's sort of just a given. And so why not enjoy the economic benefits? Why not have all these jobs brought to a state that could always use them? But the fact is that we've seen now for 20 years, more than 20 years, they've been fracking in Pennsylvania, and we've seen that the job numbers never live up to the hype. Never, not even close. And so, we're talking about communities that will really end up paying far more than they will ever reap. And that's one of the things that we do try to talk about. But we also try to talk about it in terms of ideological differences, and to say, look, a lot of the times we are kind of pitted against one another because of the positions that we take on things. And if we can learn, we all want clean water. Nobody wants to give their kid contaminated water to drink. Nobody wants to deprive their kids of a healthy environment. We have a constitutional right to it in Pennsylvania. And so if we can get past all of our ideological differences and work together, we are defeating them at their own game, because their job is to divide us and keep us divided. And so I think that has actually been pretty persuasive, especially with this data center fight, because it just does cross lines in a way I have not seen another issue cross ideological lines, where people are just saying, no, we don't like this, and we'll work with whoever we need to.
Yeah, it is interesting, the data center issue, in the regards of the fact that people are so galvanized around it and fighting so hard against it, because I've looked at it in a sense of curiosity, because there are so many other industrial types of development that people have been okay with. But the data center thing seems to be the thing that they're pushing back against. And I'm curious as to why do you think, what is the difference between the data center and a giant petrochemical facility or natural gas processing plant? Because arguably, I don't know which is worse for you to live next to as far as your immediate public health consequences. And, arguably the petrochemical facility might be worse, but we didn't see that kind of pushback against them.
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason is because, unlike fracking and petrochemicals, this is not geographically dependent. This industry can pop up wherever it wants to, and so now it's affecting people who were never affected before, and now they're seeing. I actually do think we served a purpose in our larger movement, speaking out the way we did, even if they never got engaged before they heard about it, and now that it's hitting them, they realized maybe we were talking about something for real. And so I think just setting the stage, setting the tone for the state, even if it never resulted in a lot of engagement in the past from certain parts of the state, I think it just set a tone that is now making them more receptive to what we have to say, frankly. And so so that helps. But I think that the fact that it's also something that's hitting at very acutely at the local level, that we can see that the state is making effort after effort in legislation to cut out municipal government and to restrict their ability to protect their communities, and people are really really upset about that. And so we're seeing, even in places where they have not proposed a data center yet, people feel like they might be next, and communities are showing up in droves at municipal meetings, trying to get them to update their ordinances. And the local governments are, it's mixed always, but the local governments are being pretty receptive to this, because they're the ones who know that we're going to have people competing for their own water if we allow these things to come here. And I think that's part of it too, just the scale of it. And so even though we're talking about computer population, not people population, it's the same idea that there's such a stress on our resources that we're already, having to manage carefully. How can they even talk about doing something like that? And we're sitting in the middle of a drought condition, a serious drought. How can they talk about, letting, water be used or letting energy be used to the degree that they're talking about it, especially on the side of water where you can't turn off the data center. Unlike fracking, I'm straddling the Delaware River Basin where I live, but also in my county is the Susquehanna River Basin. And they have like low flow policies. And that's the kind of way that they protect the river there. And it was always that if the water was getting low enough, they could suspend water withdrawals for fracking. Well, you can't do that with the data center, and I think people understand that too.
You mentioned like the state kind of overriding local government authority. And this is an issue that I've been very conflicted about because you have certain folks, typically like the Democrats in Pennsylvania, who seem to want it both ways. They seem to want local authority when it comes to impeding or slowing down or shutting down the industries that they don't like. But then when it came to industrial renewables, industrial solar, they at the same time are trying to kind of find ways to override local authority there. Do you think that local authority is an important feature of Pennsylvania governance?
Well, I feel like in this moment where the federal government has been rolling back protection after protection, and then the state has been so enthusiastic about one polluting industry after the next, that increasingly the one respite we have, the one place we can go is local government. Again, not perfect. There are different kinds of, township supervisor boards and borough councils, et cetera, across the state. And so you can't just paint it with such a broad brush. But in general, I think that's the one place, like they say, all politics are local. I think that's one place people feel like they do have some voice in a way that they don't. Look what we had to do with the town hall. We had to host it. The state didn't want to hear from the people. Municipal government's different. If enough people show up, I've been fighting pipelines and stuff for a long time. You have standing room only at one of those meetings and they're paying attention. Mm-hmm. And so even if they're not with you, I think they're more persuadable, frankly, than state government. And so I think even if people feel like it's an uphill battle, it's one place where they know they might be able to win it in a way that they don't feel like can win at the state. They feel like the state's not paying attention to them now.
The local level is also where so much of the burden occurs and so little of the value. The data center thing has got me really thinking about this issue of consent. You could make this argument for the last 50 years about the consent that a community should have for industrial development. But I think because of the scale of data centers, it becomes a very poignant issue that should communities have some say in a project that is this big and this impactful in their communities. Do you think that consent is something that should be more involved in the picture when it comes to industrial development?
Absolutely. You were talking a bit ago about renewables and how that, is one way that local governments are actually kind of slowing things down in a way that, the state might not want. But I used to be the chair of the planning commission here in my little borough. And, I was actually on the board of a renewable energy association at the time. And I was on the environmental advisory board for the borough. And yet we had a solar project come in, that proposal that was just wrong for us. It was just wrong. And that's the thing that you cannot overlook. Like you said, they are much more attuned to what's going on in their communities, how they will be burdened. They know their resources better than anybody. And so, so when we saw something that was wrong, as supportive as we are, we wrote the renewable ordinance for the borough. I mean, we couldn't be more enthusiastic about it. And that doesn't make every solar project the right project. And so just to kind of, write off communities that are resistant by thinking that they're just resistant to renewables. It's just not fair. And so I think, because we're not usually engaged as we should be, I think there are just sort of presumptions made about what the public is all about. And if you're not going to communicate with anybody, well, why would you expect them to understand everything right out of the box? And so I think, more engagement also educates the public in addition to giving, communities voice about what things they consent to and what things they don't. It makes for a more educated populace.
Now, you've been doing this kind of work for a while, and you've seen a lot of different industries in our state, but the general public still seems to be somewhat ignorant about industrial development in certain areas, whether that, and they tend to fall into one of two areas, either very rural areas with small, weak governments and lack of zoning or land use ordinances, et cetera, or they fall in communities that have kind of legacy industry, minority communities typically. But if you don't live in one of those two areas, a lot of this is still sort of a blind spot for you. So one of the challenges is when you start to talk to one of those people about this, you realize as the words are coming out of your mouth how overwhelming it all is.
Yeah.
How would you, in a nutshell, kind of explain to somebody who doesn't understand this issue, why this is important and why they should care about what's happening in other communities?
It's a really good question. I think that, well, in this particular instance, like I said a minute ago, even if they're not dealing with it right now, I think for some reason this one has hit them in such a way with data centers that it could be them next. And so there's always that. But even, if that's not the case, even if it's something like fracking that can't happen in certain places because there's, no gas, I think I think the way we have to talk about it is to point out that water, for instance, has no geographic boundaries. We superimpose all sorts of boundaries onto our state, onto our planet, that nature doesn't observe, and so droughts are droughts everywhere. Climate change, that's a tough one to talk to some people about, but as we see the world warming up, that's affecting everybody. So what happens in Pennsylvania doesn't stay in Pennsylvania, you could say. What things we're doing affect everybody, or things that are happening in one part of the state are affecting people everywhere in the state. And I think it's not always the most persuasive thing, because if people are, steadfastly against believing in climate change, that's not necessarily going to persuade them. But I do think that over time, people have seen some of these things happening. They're seeing more frequent droughts, and some of that is, coming home to roost. And I think one of the things that was very persuasive a couple of years ago was the wildfire smoke that we were smelling in Pennsylvania from Canada. I think, there have been these instances, unfortunately, where what has been, what people warning about for a long time is now coming to pass, and people are seeing that. So I think it's always going to be an uphill battle to some degree, but I do think that there's some evidence, and I think there's some way of generalizing to say, like, we're all part of the same ecosystem in the end. We're all part of the same planet. We all are dependent on one another, and therefore you can't look at something as being their problem. It's our problem. It's always our problem.
So Governor Shapiro did not attend the virtual town hall. I was wondering if you had something specifically that you wanted Governor Shapiro to know.
I think Governor Shapiro needs to stop representing the industry, putting the industry, and you could pretty much fill in a blank about what that industry is sometimes, but stop putting industry in general for the people that he represents. And I think that what happened with Montour County and the right to know request that they did, I think that was just so revealing. And I don't know if you were paying attention to that story or if all of your viewers have been paying attention, but the concerned citizens of Montour County had submitted a right to know request for information about what was happening with things that are proposed for their area. And they got back this trove of documents that included an email from the governor to the head of Amazon, the CEO of Amazon Web Services, saying, "My door is always open to you. And, if you have any ideas or thoughts or whatever, get in touch, stay in touch." And that we don't, well, he says things like that to the public, there's no wrong door to government, no. But we keep hitting the wrong door. Anybody who goes there hits the wrong door, the one that's locked with a guard in front of it. And so I think people understand that, he really doesn't represent us. Increasingly, I mean, you heard, like you referred to at the beginning, one of our speakers at the end of the town hall said that she will do everything in her power to make sure that Governor Shapiro is never, elected to another office again. And this is somebody who's going to volunteer for him. And so I think seeing, how little regard he has for his constituents is not being missed by them. And that's something he should be aware of and be concerned about. But I think the other thing is that there's been so little transparency, because I've done this now under 4 governors. This is the worst governor I've had to deal with. And, the fact that all these things are decided behind closed doors and the public isn't engaged at all, not even, asking them their opinion, but just telling them that something's coming. I mean, truly, people were blindsided by the data centers, but somebody else knew, somebody negotiating those deals, hammering out those deals. And so, for instance, one really bad document that was in the Right to Know was the one from Rick Seiger, who's at the Department of Community and Economic Development. He's the secretary. It was the day that Shapiro was going to do his budget address, and he was going to announce his grid initiative that he consulted with the community about. We don't know what community that would be because it wasn't us. But, he consulted with the community to do this grid initiative that would make sure that we're doing data centers right, community benefit agreements, bring your own energy. Da, da, da. And so this email that's in the Right to Know request response from Rick Seiger to Amazon said the morning of the budget address says, Governor Shapiro is going to be announcing this grid initiative. Don't worry, you'll get to review it and basically write it before it's real. But also don't worry, because he's really not going to enforce it. It's going to be optional. When that's not what he's telling the crowd a couple hours later. That it's and in everything that we got back, the reporters who reported on the town hall who got in touch with the governor's office, everything we heard out of them after it, I mean, they were saying that the grid initiative is this great protection that the governor's sensitive. They're bringing up exactly the thing that their guy actually outed for being just an optional kind of nonsense thing. And so, I just think, I don't know if he thinks he's smarter than he is, but I think he should also wise up to the fact that we're not idiots.
The last question I have for you is, is there a place for data centers? I mean, there's a lot that's been made of AI and its sort of exponential scaling of data centers, but data centers have been around for a long time. It's if you shop on Amazon, if you use social media, I mean, we're using Zoom, which relies on data centers. And so there is this sort of tension between can we can't have the modern world without them. And so the position seems unrealistic to say that there should never be any data center development at all. So, how do you reconcile that? What do you think needs to happen? And how do you envision responsible data center development if you think that that's possible?
Well, so what we're talking about in Pennsylvania right now is largely the hyperscalers that would be far larger and far more impactful than the many, many data centers we already have. Like, I think we have 7,000 plus in this country, whereas China, who we're supposed to be doing this, in response to, so we need to compete, has like 400. But that said, so they definitely exist. And so one of the questions is about having any kind of planning at all behind any of this. Something that happened so suddenly that suddenly we're having to have 50 plus data centers proposed in the state. And I just read another thing today about Upper Marion outside of Philadelphia having, I think, proposals for 8 more. And I know we have 8 more that are being talked about in my area. So we don't even know where this stops. But, suddenly go from 0 to 60 on something that is well understood to be an early technology. We think about cell phones with computers basically we carry in our pockets now, but they started out like luggage. The early cell phones were huge. And so why can't we ever, ever plan for how technology is going to change and how we're just going to be creating a lot of stranded assets by building all these things willy-nilly without really thinking about it? Whatever happened to the precautionary principle? Why can't we actually do anything in a measured, sensible way? And so there's nothing inherently wrong with AI. There's nothing inherently wrong with data centers. They aren't good or bad things. They are just things. It's how we handle them that make them good or bad. And we are terrible at new technologies usually. And we have gotten ourselves into lots of trouble because of it. And because AI is such a particular kind of threat, that makes it even more scary because we're creating machines that are smarter than we are and know more than we are. So that's a whole nother level of fear that people legitimately have about all of this. But, the data centers themselves, I think already when we were just getting started with it, we were already hearing talk about how in some experiments they were putting data centers effectively on like a laptop computer that, that it's going to scale down significantly. And can't we take a breath and figure out what's the right way to do this? So it's not necessarily hard no on data. We obviously, like you said, rely on being able to manage data for so much of what we do, but how to do it is really the question. And do we have to, go along with just some sort of knee-jerk thing where they really don't make the case to the state about why we need to do this other than because China? That's not a good enough answer. It's just not.
Yeah. Well, Karen, thank you so much for being with us today. This was a very informative conversation.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. This is why I don't get invited to dinner parties anymore, because I can't not talk about this. So thank you.
All right. Well, we'll keep in touch, and you'll keep us posted on updates and things as this progresses. Especially, especially interested on your side of the state because I'm way over here on the western side.
Yes, I'm more than happy to be working with everybody everywhere in the state and beyond because, we, like I said before, this is everybody's issue. So happy to collaborate every way that we possibly can. And again, grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about it today.
Great. All right. And that's Karen Feridun with Better Path Coalition. And we'll see you guys later. Thank you.